Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Farm Chatter podcast. I know it's been a brief 2-week hiatus with Sukkot's schedule and the whole Yom Tov schedule this year. So just took a brief 2-week break, but now we're back with this episode and many more informative and interesting episodes already recorded and many more planned as well coming. I just wanted to hop on the podcast before this episode to say that I've been looking into various ways of improving the audio quality of the podcast. So various equipment and services and subscriptions. So if anyone is able to help out with that, interested, willing, and helping out with that, the website, farmchatter.com, has there's a PayPal link there in general if anyone wants to sponsor anything, but I'll put that in the show's notes so anyone willing can put any amount, is much appreciated. Or if you're interested in alternative forms of paying, again, if you're able to help out or you're willing to, you can email me, farmchatter@gmail.com. And again, if you're able to, any amount, very much appreciated. Just wanted to also say thank you to everyone who has, given any suggestions or feedback and comments. I've gotten a bunch of that recently. And if anyone is interested, has any feedback or any suggestions, always looking for suggestions for guests. Many of these episodes and these guests come about through listener suggestions or making connections with guests. So if anyone has, please email me, farmchatter@gmail.com. And also about rating, if anyone's able to rate the episode especially on the podcast, especially on Apple, but also on Spotify. Now they have a rating system as well. It's very much appreciated. So with that, welcome back to the podcast and enjoy the episode. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Sefer Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined once again by Mr. Dan Klein, who is the editor and translator of Shadal on Chumash, and as well as the author of a number of articles related to Shadal. And this episode will be discussing specifically Shadal's Sefer called Ohev Ger, which is his maybe most important work, which is the most well-known, which is about Onkelos. He has a column on Onkelos and different textual variants and Gersayos and Onkelos, so we'll be discussing that. The inspiration for this episode was there was a new Hebrew edition that just came out from in Eretz Yisrael. So thank you, first of all, Dan, for joining me once again.
My pleasure.
All right, so let's start off, although we did do a pretty lengthy episode about a year and a half ago on Shadal, so I would refer any listeners interested in hearing about Shadal and his full life there. But just briefly to recap for those maybe who don't know about Shadal or don't want it in such a long format, just briefly a little bit about Shadal before we discuss the Sefer and this work of his.
Just briefly, let's talk about his life and background. His dates were 1800 to 1865. I always point out this is roughly equivalent to Abraham Lincoln. That puts him in historic perspective. He was born in the city of Trieste, which then was part of the Austrian Empire, later became part of Italy. He was Italian Jewish by culture, but he never lived in a country called Italy. That's a little oddment there. He spent most of his career at the first school of its kind in the world, the Collegio Rabbinico in Padua, Italy. It was not traditionally yeshiva; it was a training school for rabbis. They learned Gemara, they learned Halacha, but they also concentrated very much on Tanakh, Hebrew language, and Jewish history. And those were the subjects that Shadal mostly taught his classes in. He was a very prolific writer. One of the first important books that he wrote was Ohev Ger, which is the subject of our talk tonight. He wrote Perushim on Chamisha Chumashei Torah, on Sefer Yeshaya, which some consider his masterwork. He wrote Perushim on various other books of Tanakh, translated some of them also into Italian, and wrote a book that has been translated into English. It's called Luzzatto's Ethico-Psychological Interpretation of Judaism, which is a very fancy way of saying he found some very interesting things to say about what motivates people to be observant. The two main motivations in his view were this sense of compassion, which is a very basic human trait. But sometimes the sense of compassion gets overruled by people's ego and people's personal interests. And the other great yesod of observance is fear of God and fear of what he might do to you if you aren't fulfilling your obligations of chemla and other obligations. He had a difficult life. He spent most of his career at this Collegio Rabbinico, which never paid very well. His first wife passed away. He married her sister afterwards. He had, I think, 8 children, 5 of whom predeceased him. It was a very difficult and tragic life. He only lived to be 65. Parenthetically, I'm older than that now myself, and I haven't translated nearly everything that I have been able to or should be able to about or by Shadal. I'd like to get as much as I can done in the years that are to come. That gives you a basic background of him. He is a little bit hard to pigeonhole. He was a maskil. He was a participant in what you call the Haskalah, which is the Jewish Enlightenment, the academic study of Jewish texts. He was very involved with that. And yet he stood apart from the other maskilim, many of the other maskilim, in the sense that he thought they were only in it for personal glory and for studying something, just as they might have also studied ancient Persia or ancient Babylonia. They weren't, in his view, studying the Jewish texts because they were living texts and living ways of life. He very much believed they were, and took others to task if that was not their focus. So he had a foot in both worlds, and he's a little bit hard to classify, and even to this day, some people don't quite know what to make of him.
Right, for sure. And again, I refer listeners back to the previous episode, as well as, I don't know if I assume we mentioned, but now I'm remembering, so I'm going to say Shadal, Shmuel, David, Luzzatto, and as well as, he also, the Haksav HaKabbalah, to quote one example that people know, quotes him many times in his commentary on Chumash. So he is quoted, but yeah, like you said, complex. Okay, and Ohev Ger is quoted, as we'll discuss Ohev Ger. So Ohev Ger is a sefer of his. It's a pretty, I don't know, one of the first, I don't want to say exactly, it's not, but it's one of the...
I think his first major work of research.
Right, his, and also one of the first farm like this on Onkelos, as he talks about in his introduction, that he decided to write on Onkelos. So, broadly speaking, what's the sefer about in general, before we get more into why he wrote it and specifics of the sefer?
Okay, to look just from the title page, tells you, it's a very busy title page, and it tells you a lot about what the book is about. It's the methodology of Onkelos in writing his Targum, his Aramaic translation. It's called a ma'amar mechkari, a work of research. Another description that gives on the title page is Be'ur drachav unetivotav betargumo, and an investigation of his methods and his pathways in his translation. This title page also tells you there are 450 corrected or variant readings gathered from rare and ancient print books and manuscripts of Onkelos, plus a discussion of the Syriac language, which is a variety of Aramaic, which Shadal was one of the first Jewish scholars to pay a lot of attention to, because he felt it was very useful in understanding the Jewish component of Aramaic. Syriac was mostly Christian Syrians who spoke that, but he felt it was very useful. So he had a list of 125 Aramaic words that could only be properly understood in light of Syriac. That's a lot for a title page, but that gives you some idea of what the book is about.
Yeah, if anyone can see it, obviously now I'll put a link to, if I find a link to the original edition, and then also I will put a link to the new edition. Like I said, it's an Israeli site, so I don't know how easy it is to get in America, but we'll get to that at the end of the show. But you can see the title page. It's quite busy. It also appears in, I'm not sure if it's Italian. It's like a mix of, and it has his, that title, Philoxenus.
The second title page is all in Latin, because that was the way scholarship was done back then. It was 1830.
Yeah, and as he calls it philoxenus, why was it? What does that mean? Why is it called that? Is that word Latin or that's not a Latin word?
Let's talk about that. Yeah. Um, the Hebrew Ohev Ger, love of the Ger, which is an interesting term in itself, is he called it that because he had high respect for Onkelos, who, according to tradition, was a Ger Tzedek. Apparently, he had been a Roman citizen. There are conflicting reports in the Gemara as to just what family he stemmed from. It might have been Titus, it might have been Hadrian, a fairly high up connection in the Roman system for sure. And we don't really know how it was that he became a Ger, but there are various stories about that. There's a very interesting story about whichever emperor it was, Hadrian or Titus or maybe some other well-connected Roman relatives, decided this was really not a good idea to have this Jewish person in the family, sent a group of Roman soldiers to dissuade him from following this path. All that accomplished was that he converted them. And 2 more contingents were sent, and he just kept converting them, and then the Roman family decided, okay, that's enough. So the phrase Ohev Ger actually comes from the Torah. I mean, we've told repeatedly, V'ahavtem et hager, we must love the Ger. Usually in context, Shadal himself translates that as the foreigner, not as somebody who converted. That's what the pshat really is if you look at it. I mean, if it says ki gerim because you were gerim in Eretz Mitzrayim, that it's hard to say that we were converts. We were strangers. We were foreigners, and so we should know what it's like to be a foreigner, and we are commanded to love those people. But the phrase Ohev Ger actually refers to a Kadosh Baruch Hu himself, because there's a pasuk in Devarim. The Ohev Ger latet lo lechem b'simla. God is the one who loves the Ger, whoever the Ger is, a stranger or foreigner or somebody coming within the Jewish people, who loves him enough to keep him supplied with food and clothing. Just the other day, I found that there is a new organization in Israel in support of Gerei Tzedek, and it's called Ohev Ger, which is very nice. Okay, now in Greek, Ohev Ger translates to philoxenus. Philo, like in philosophy, love of knowledge. Xenus, as like in xenophobia, fear of the foreigner. But philoxenus is love of the stranger. Apparently, there was a well-established classic Greek name, Philoxenus. Shadal didn't make this up. If you look in Wikipedia, it lists several prominent gentlemen with that name, including a scholar of Syriac, and I have a feeling that Shadal must have known about that. There was a king by that name, a general by that name, a painter called Philoxenus, and even, quote unquote, a legendary glutton named Philoxenus. In Italian, it gets changed a little bit to Filoseno, which was the name that he gave his own son. When he had his son, it was in 1829, and the Ohev Ger was just about to be published. He was so proud of his work and so attached to the idea of loving the Ger and loving Onkelos that he named his own son Ohev Ger Luzzatto. In Italian, it was Filoseno. And he actually followed this derech, if you will, of naming his children. He was very involved a little bit later in translating and writing a parish on Yeshaya. He named his child Yeshaya. Unfortunately, that child died very young, but not to be deterred, when he had another son, he named that son Yeshaya. And that was one of the sons who actually outlived Shadal and helped bring some of his books to be published. He also had a son when he was working on the book of Eov. That was not a terribly auspicious name to give a son, but he called him Baruch Eov. Unfortunately, that son also died young. It's part of the tragedy of Shadal's life. Filoseno died in his 20s. He was a very promising scholar in his own right, apparently he developed cancer and died young, and his father really never recovered from that shock. So that's the name Ohev Ger.
Okay, very interesting. Yeah, and it's interesting that his son's name was Ohev Ger. So the work, something that, why did Shadal write the work? Now, an important part of this obviously is his introduction, his hakdama, which, by the way, so the edition that I had before this new one came out, and a lot of people probably have as a facsimile of the Krakow edition, which was the second edition. So the new edition is kind of the third edition, because there was this, well, if you don't count the facsimile edition just as a republish. But that second edition, which was then a facsimile, is missing the hakdama for some reason. But so either it's in the original, which was published in 1830, or it's now in this brand new edition just published that has this hakdama. So he does talk about there a little bit, but why did he decide to write this? And again, the work mainly is in the beginning. It's these, we'll talk about it, 32 nisivim, where 32 general rules, and he talks about with Onkelos and how Onkelos decided to translate things, as well as where the girsayos, the different variants in the text of Onkelos.
Okay, well, again, it's really a shame that this second edition of Ohev Ger, which I also happen to have a facsimile of, doesn't have his main introduction, which really explains the answers to the questions we've just been thinking about. Why did Shadal write this book? In his introduction to this first edition, he says that he was astonished that for all the perushim that have been written on the Mishnah, on the Talmud, on the Midrashim, there hadn't, to his knowledge, been one on Targum Onkelos, which preceded them all. He set great store on Onkelos, not only as a translator, but as an interpreter. And it struck him as very odd that no one had really devoted a lot of attention to this very important resource. He did mention that both Rashi and Ramban cite Onkelos very often, as we know, sometimes differ from him, but their main focus in writing the Perushim, of course, was not to discuss or explain the Targum, but to bring him in as an important reference point and agree or disagree, but not the main focus of their writing. But when Shadal was, early teens, he was rummaging around in the Geniza of the community of Trieste and found this incredibly old book from the 1400s, missing a title page, missing an author, but otherwise intact. And lo and behold, it was the discussion of Onkelos. It was organized parsha by parsha, pasuk by pasuk, explaining points of Onkelos that needed explaining. It was not a comprehensive work. It does discuss changes that Onkelos made from the literal meaning, which was a very important focus of Shadal's own research, as we will see. But Shadal kind of took this book and put it to one side, and only took it up as a focus of his scholarship later in life, and used it as a main resource in his own treatment of Onkelos in the book of Ohev Ger. And he was very puzzled, again, that this is something that you're supposed to be reading every week, Shnayim b'Mikra Echad b'Targum. And if so, why has there not been a work correcting all the corruptions that have gotten into the text of Onkelos? And there he stops and says, wait a minute, my readers might be thinking, how dare you say that there's corruptions have entered into Onkelos? How do you know that? No one ever brought that to our attention. It seems perfectly all right. Why are you saying this? So he explains. He gradually became acquainted with older printed editions of Onkelos. There was one particular reading that he found problematic. He asked a friend to help him out with it. His friend had a very old edition of the Chumash that was printed in Lisbon, and he looked into what the text of Onkelos was there, and lo and behold, it was different from the standard. And from there, he went on and compared other old volumes, one that was printed by Bamberg in Venice, one that was printed in Amsterdam, one in Vienna, various others, at least 10 of them. And looking through these old printings and manuscripts, he found many, many variants of the Onkelos texts. Some of them he thought were better than the normal text. Some of them he thought maybe were just mistakes. He also, again, looked at this very old book that he had found, the Geniza. It's a cute thing about that book. He saw that there was no existing title page. He didn't know what the book was actually called, so he gave it his own name. He saw that it was printed in the year, we would say, Reish Yud Aleph, but he rearranged those letters into Yud Aleph Reish and called it Ya'er, the book that gives light. And he always referred to it by that name, Sefer Ya'er. Apparently later in life, he found out that the real name of the book was Sefer Patshegen. And sometimes he refers to it with that name also. But most often when he refers to the book, he calls it Ya'er. So eventually, before he was very old, he was at the age of 29 or 30, he wrote this very exhaustive study of the variant readings of Onkelos and called it Ohev Ger. The beginning of the book, which to my mind is the much more interesting one to read, is the 32 approaches, or nativot, as he calls them, that Onkelos took in changing the original text, the original Hebrew, where he found it problematic to his audience. And we can talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I think the Sefer. I mean, I have a work, a Chumash with a couple of it's an old thing with a couple of old mefarshim together. I think the Sefer Yair is printed in there. At least it's called that. I don't know if it's the same exact one. I think it might be, but I don't have to double check on that. Yeah, he does call it that. Like he said actually it was in 1451. It was Hutak. I guess it was like copied that year. It was printed and it was like copied of the manuscript that he had. That's why he called it that. So yeah, so the first thing before we get into his 32, like I said, Nesivos, his klalim, his rules, he starts out with saying, why was Onkelos, writing? Who was he writing the translation for? This is his first big thing. So talk a little bit about that. Why Onkelos decided to translate the Torah and who it was geared towards, in Shadal's opinion.
Yeah, this is very interesting because toward the beginning of his introduction, and I wrote out a little, an abridged translation of what he wrote. It's very flowery. He says, the great principle on which everything depends in understanding the methods of Onkelos and his Targum is a well-established thing, and yet perhaps no one has yet taken it to heart. And many of my readers will hiss and gnash their teeth, like harku shame, over this idea. Therefore, with a soft voice and great seriousness, out of love of the truth, and for the honor of the righteous Ger, whose way has been hidden throughout the generations, I will reveal it and say, what's his big reveal here? The Targum was not made for scholars, but for the common people. And he felt that maybe some people might be shocked by this idea, but he goes on to illustrate very clearly how this must be true. In taking examples of changes in wording and phraseology that Onkelos made to avoid misleading the common people, avoid misleading fellow Gerim or would-be Gerim, even more importantly, who might be put off by some of the phraseology that they see in the Torah. He wanted to avoid confusing people that Shadal refers to as kale da'at, people who are perhaps less than highly intelligent, or even more important, scoffers, people who might see problematic wording in the Torah and say, well, no, that's just ridiculous. Onkelos apparently was very focused on avoiding these kinds of problems, according to Shadal, and I think it does make sense. I think he bears it out. Now, there was a somewhat later book written about Targum Onkelos by the chief rabbi of Great Britain, Nathan Marcus Adler. He wrote a book called Nitina Lager, and it's a slightly more up-to-date work of scholarship about Onkelos. One of his main points was, no, he did not believe that Onkelos was written only for the common people. It was, according to Rabbi Adler, it was for the scholars and the common people alike. But I think bottom line is, if he was, if, at least even part of his audience was the common folk, I think it does make a lot of sense to understand what he did in those terms. So I don't think Rabbi Adler is really refuting completely what Shadal had to say.
And I believe that Nisin Olager quotes Shadal and Ohev Ger as well. And something else, so when he says this, he says, Ayin Rashi Megillah, Chaf Aleph Amud Beis. I believe that there's a Mishnah, I believe he must be talking about this Rashi. Rashi says, Benovi afilu echad kairin v'shnayim metargaminon. Metargamin, sorry. Rashi says, Shatargam ein elo lahashmiya l'nashim ve'amei ha'aretz. She'ein makirim b'lashon ha'kodesh. V'targam ulaza bavliyim. So Rashi's saying, and he goes on. So he goes on. So he's basically, I assume, alluding to this Rashi, that Rashi's saying, Rashi's talking about general Targum. The Targum would translate the Torah, but must be referring, I assume he's referring to this Rashi, saying, look, he's saying the Targum was meant for the Amei Haaretz. That's who it was meant for, just the regular people, so to speak. So,
does fit in. Let me just also point out, just a sentence or two about why the whole Targum Onkelos was written in the first place. There are various accounts of the history of the Targum. It was so well received and so accepted among the Chachamim that they theorized that the Aramaic translation that we now call Onkelos was given really at the same time as the Torah itself. At some point it was lost, and then Onkelos helped to recover it. Rabbi Adler had a theory that actually Ezra was the first to translate the Torah into Aramaic, which makes sense because when the people were exiled into Bavel, the Aramaic was their language. That became their common language. That's when, in the more historic way of looking at things, that's when such an Aramaic Targum would have been needed. However, it wasn't written down originally by Ezra. Shadal points out it was part of Torah Sheba'al Peh, which was not supposed to be written down. And then, unfortunately, because it was not in a written text, there were various corruptions that came in. People were beginning to forget it. And it was fastened down again by Onkelos, who, according to most people, lived in the 1st century CE. There's a more recent an English translation of Onkelos by, what are their names? Two rabbis, Stanley Wagner and Israel Drazen. Israel Drazen came up with the theory that Onkelos lived much later than anybody else thought, more like in the 400s CE, because he found elements of Midrashim that he feels that Onkelos could not have been referring to unless they already existed and they had come on the scene later. So he post-dates Onkelos. I'm not sure if that's the most accepted idea now, but at least that idea is out there. But nobody really knows much about Onkelos, who he was, when he lived. All they know is his translation is absolutely brilliant and useful to this day.
Right. Okay. So Shadal now goes into 4 broad rules of when Onkelos, changes or adds to the text in his translation. And then he kind of breaks it down, like I said, in 32 klalim, 32, nisivas, as he said, and we can kind of get into those. But first, his broad 4 general rules, and then we'll get, a little bit more in depth.
Yes, the 4 rules that Shadal groups these changes into. Number 1, where he changes the language of the original while preserving the meaning. Number 2, where he changes the language with also a change of meaning, which is a little bit more revolutionary. Number 3, adding language. Onkelos is adding language while preserving the meaning. And number 4, adding language with a change of meaning. Those are the 4 basic approaches that he sees Onkelos following.
Now, in these, there's a reason why. As he goes through now in his 32 different rules, he explains why. Onkelos wasn't just changing it, so he explains why he would change it in different things. The second one, l'chavod maila, for Hashem, l'harchik kol machshavas riboy elahos, so people shouldn't think there's more gods. That's why. It's just one reason. we can go on and on. So let's, if there's something you want to pick out and just, he explains why there was change or it was added to, or and then we can pick out some specific examples. So perhaps there's some that you want to start with, and then I can, maybe throw some out, and we can discuss some of them over here.
All right. I was mentioning before we started our recording, I had a little bit of fun with this on Shavuos night. I was speaking to a small group of people in a shul in the wee hours, and I gave a talk that was called "You Can Help Onkelos Write His Targum." And I pulled out some of the examples that Shadal gave, and I said, first of all, what's bothering Onkelos? I mean, that's so important for understanding any parish. You have volumes of what's bothering Rashi. The same thing for Onkelos. What was bothering him? What is the Torah actually trying to say that could be said in a different way? How do you think he should have rephrased it? And let's compare what he actually did with it. And then an extra question, if it was so problematic for the Torah to phrase something in a certain way, why did the Torah do that in the first place? These are all very interesting questions, and I think we can discuss just a few examples and illustrate what Onkelos' thinking was. First of all, the expression Elohim Acherim, other gods. I said to my audience, what's the problem with that? I think they caught on pretty easily. If you're using the same word that we also refer to our God by, isn't that a problem? So, okay, let's just acknowledge that's a problem, at least in the time and place of Onkelos. What is the Torah actually trying to say here? Other gods. Obviously, it doesn't mean that the Torah thinks there are other valid gods. Probably what it means is other things that are worshipped. Maybe it means other idols. And so that, in fact, is what Onkelos comes out with. His translation of Elohim Acherim is Ta'avat Amimaya, the idols or those things that are worshipped by the nations, avoiding that problem of Elohim with a small aleph, so-called. I asked my audience, well, if that's such a problem, why did the Torah use that word that so much offends us? I think the answer is the original audience would have not really have had a problem. They would have understood that there is a capital aleph and a small aleph. And sometimes it's used for our genuine God, and sometimes it's used for those other things that people think are gods. But by the time Onkelos came on the scene, that Hebrew word was not used for anything but our God, and to have it used, like as I've been saying, with a small aleph for other people would have been bothersome or confusing or problematic for the audience of that time. That's why Onkelos changed it. And this is an example of his number 2 of the 32 Netivot, avoidance of the impression that there is more than one God. And he gives other examples as well. Here's another one, a very famous pasuk from Noach. After the flood, Noach brings a carbon, and it says of Hashem, Vayarach Hashem et reach hanichoach. God smelled the pleasing aroma. Okay, obviously the problem with that is it sounds like God is a human being who likes to enjoys good aromas. Is that really the way we want to think about God? Next question, what is the Torah actually trying to say? The Torah is actually trying to say God accepted the carbon. And that's exactly what Onkelos translated it more literally to say. He said, V'kabel Hashem b'ra'ava yad korbaneh. God accepted with grace or willingly his sacrifice. Nothing there about a pleasing aroma. We've gotten rid of that. Again, why, if it's such a problem, why did the Torah phrase it that way in the first place? Because in the days of the original audience of the Torah, as Shadal actually put it, people were on a lower intellectual plane. They were used to the idea of, from other cultures, of God smelling a pleasing aroma and deciding because of that physical sense of pleasure that he ought to be act well toward the people who made the carbon. The original audience would have understood it that way. By the time of Onkelos, when there were no more idol worshippers, really, there were, at least in the Middle East of the Bnei Israel, it was no longer a temptation of Bnei Israel to worship Avodah Zarah. It was a problem to look at God that way. And this is an example of native number 3, avoidance of anthropomorphisms, which is the ascription of physical attributes to God. Rambam also very much was of the opinion that Onkelos' one of his main emphases was to get rid of these anthropomorphisms. So that idea in itself was not original with Shadal, but he also recognized the importance of it. Here is one of my favorite examples. When Yaakov and his family escape from Lavan, and Lavan catches up with them, and he accuses them of running away. And by the way, Rachel had taken away the terafim, these household gods. And Lavan says, Lama ganavta et Elohai. Why did you steal my gods? Obviously, this sounds like a problem because, again, we don't like to use that word in reference to things that aren't really God. So what is Lavan actually saying here? He's saying, why did you steal those things that I worship? You could put it that way. And in fact, the way, and then I said to my audience, that Shavuos night, I said, we could translate this as, why did you steal my idols? That would solve one problem. But would Lavan really have been speaking that way? Would he have referred to his own deities as idols? Probably not. So Onkelos had to be very careful here and very clever in how he translated this. He didn't want to use Elohai. He perhaps didn't want to use a word for idols. He settled on something very clever. He said, why did you steal Yat Dachlati, that which I fear? Which I think is a very clever way of expressing the idea of what Lavan was asking without using problematic language, either too good or too bad. So I think that it illustrates how clever Onkelos was. Again, why did the Torah use that word Elohai if it was such a problematic word? Again, as we said before, the original audience of the Torah probably would not have had a problem with that. They would have understood that there's this kind of Elohai and the other kind that really means something. And this is an example of native number 4 in Shadal's system, avoidance of seemingly negative references to God. Some of these nativot overlap with each other a little bit. He has 32 of them all together. I won't go into all 32 because there's no need for that. But these are just some examples of the way Shadal analyzed what Onkelos was up to and gave multiple examples for each of these approaches. And I think this is, to me, it's the most valuable part of the book, the most interesting part for the modern reader.
Yeah, they're really interesting. And the new edition, didn't add notes here, unfortunately, as notes we'll talk about in the textual variant. I think it should have had notes here and broken this up and done a nicer job. But it's nice. And they did add sources, though, for each pasuk where it is. Just picking up on the one that you were talking about, another issue with the Trafim story and that whole parsha of Yaakov and Lavan is that the Torah says, Lamo ganafta salihai, and then it says, V'yignev Yaakov es lo'ev Lavan arami, it says steal. So Onkelos, Shadal points out in the 5th one is that it's accusing the others of being thieves, chas v'shalom. So therefore he changes it to V'yignev Yaakov es lo'ev Lavan arami v'kisi Yaakov min Lavan armo, or ma'asisa v'tiknev es lavavi v'kisistu minei. I guess he covered, kind of hidden. He doesn't want to say he stole. So as Onkelos puts it, shinu haloshin bavor kavod ha'uma v'aveseh, to in honor, to respect the others, but not attributing theft. I believe is somewhere else here. I can't find. I think he also says similar by with Yaakov and the brachas and Esav. Yeah, I think so. So those are another way.
Yeah, I actually had that example when I spoke late at night. I'll just give just one more. The very well-known and hard to interpret phrase when we talk about from the period between Pesach and Shavuos, you start counting the Mocharat HaShabbat, the day after the Shabbat. And it's an old debate. What does that actually mean? Certainly the Karaites said it was always starting on a Shabbat, and so the Shavuos was always on a Sunday. I believe that Tzdukim also felt that way. It was an old debate, and Onkelos was quite aware of this, and he had to do something about translating that phrase in a way that would be acceptable to us mainstream Jews. And so what he did with it was he translated as Mivatar Yom HaTava, from after the Yom Tov, the holiday, the first day of Pesach, in other words. So he was very obviously taking a stand here in favor of the mainstream opinion of the Chachamim as against the position. I believe it goes back to Tzeduk, and certainly was followed later by the Karaites. So that was another of the Nitivot, number 9, conformance with Torah Shebaal Peh, to avoid confusion. Again, the audience who originally received the Torah probably understood what that was all about, but the meaning became more obscure later on. It became a subject of very heated controversy, and so Onkelos had to do something to resolve that problem.
Right, I think a lot of this, as he says, I think he says it in his Dama, right, that they spoke Aramaic, so they did, like you were saying earlier, they when they heard the word Elohim, they assumed it was referring to Hashem, not for Avodah Zarah, for idols. They didn't know. So this goes very well with his rule that Onkelos was written for the Am Ha'aretz and the regular people. So therefore, he was translating, this was one of his big concerns. You mentioned his Gashmos is something the Rambam is busy with. Shadal argues with the Rambam. That's not the only reason what Onkelos was doing. The Rambam holds that's the main reason, but he talks about that at length. There's some more lengthy discussion here of what the Rambam. He quotes a bunch of Akedah, B'tzkarama. Something else also in the 9th one, also as a follow-up, he says, Vayula Taitafis B'neinecha, he says, L'tfilin, because he wants to tell you, according to Chazal, that you have to wear tefillin. It's not just anything, Taitafa is to just make it up. It's tefillin. He says the way that we know how to Kitav Nisan, I do it Yisrael, the way we know how you, prepare tefillin and you wear tefillin. So he's translating it, tefillin. And again, he goes on and on.
That particular example might fit in also with another of his rules, which was avoidance of hard to understand figures of speech. Or I mean, what's totafot anyway? And nobody can really agree with what the etymology is or what it actually describes. But if just to overcome that problem, if you say that it's tefillin, everybody knows what that is, and makes things a whole lot simpler, especially for the common people.
Also, I just found the other one I was referring to earlier with Yaakov and Esav. He says it's 13. He says Shino ha'inyan, it's avor kavod ha'uma v'aveseh. It changes the inyan for a covet, and he says when Yaakov says, but when Yitzchak tells Yaakov, but when tells Esav, ba'achicha b'mirma, the trickery.
Oh yes.
He says b'chuchma v'kavod. I mean, it always jumps out to me. I've ever done Shnai Mikra. You see these type of things, you jump out at you, but that's not what Yitzchak said. And he says, no, b'chuchma v'kavod. So this is another one that he's actually, this is changing it, because the pasuk says b'mirma, and Onkelos goes, no, b'chachma. So he's actually totally changing that. So this is another example. And again, there's many of these. It's well worth to read it, at least to see what he says. Very, very interesting. Like you said, this it's not even introduction. He calls it Chelik Rishon. It's the first part of the work.
Yeah, I think it's important to note that if you don't analyze Onkelos in the way that Shadal is doing, you might think, well, Onkelos is guilty of whitewashing. I mean, he's trying to make Yaakov look less dishonorable. It's not Mirma, it's Chachma. Where does he get off doing that? But I think if you understand what Onkelos' motivation was, according to Shadal, that makes it more understandable and more defensible, I think.
Right. Another thing I'm picking out, just one more, like from 22, he says that he goes through this. He uses a couple of these in different places, actually. a lot of these klalim for when he adds or when he changes, but another interesting one is Levara Sosim, something that's just, Sosim is not explained. It says, V'chein ve'etz hadas toivara, so good and bad. What exactly is this? There's Machlekes Rishonim, there's a lot of discussion about that. He says, V'ilin da'achlin peroi chachmin ben tav levish. So he tries to add in a little more. I mean, I'm just throwing out. There's many more. I don't want to go. People can check it out. What he talks about. I think, like I said, I'll put a link to this edition. I think though there is the old edition. I don't know, Dan. Did you tell me is available online? Can people find the old edition online somewhere?
It is available. There's a wonderful link. Like a department store for Shadal. It's called Shadal Online. All you do is go to that link. It has a long list of books of his in various different formats, and you can just click on any of those links, and magically you can find all those things online, including the first edition of Ohev Ger, which, as we pointed out, is important because it has that introduction that somehow got left out from the second edition, has been restored in the latest one. The only way I was able myself to access that very important introduction was to go to the Shadal online page and click on that link. It's very easy to find once you know.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so that's for the beginning. Obviously, there's much more. We'll just leave this for now. Now, the second part of the Sefer, which is where he discusses through, like I said, the Girsa, it's a textual, variance. It goes parsha by parsha, and this one, the new edition, actually has footnotes on, and there is actually some notes on this one. So, I mean, talk a little about this. I mean, you mentioned kind of he found some old editions, manuscripts. Do you know what he used or why he decided to do this? At this point, no one else did it. He decided it's something that had to be done. Why?
Go on.
No, go ahead. I mean, why? Just about the second. Just talk a little bit about the second part of the Sefer. What it's about and why he did something like this.
Okay, this is what Shadal actually considered the meat of the book. It's not something you would curl up in bed and enjoy for a nightcap, but it is actually very important. He goes parsha by parsha, pasuk by pasuk, giving examples of problematic readings of Onkelos as became established in standard printed works, and comparing them to other readings that he had in either very old printed Chumashim or manuscripts. As I mentioned, there was Venice, there was Amsterdam, Lisbon, Vienna, others, where he either found what he thought were preferable readings, or sometimes he just found variant readings and he said, that's not really right, and I think the standard reading is better. But he went into great depth and detail examining these problematic readings and their variants. And as I said before, he suspected that most readers might say, well, how dare you say that the text of Onkelos is corrupt? He had very detailed proof that it was. And I think he performed a great service in pointing out what the problems were and what the perhaps preferable readings would be, so that when you read your Shnayim B'Mikra and Echad Targum, you have a much better idea of what it is that Onkelos is trying to say.
Yeah, do you know what was the reception like of this work by his contemporaries and after it was published?
Let me point out, first of all, when I said before that as he was doing his research, he was under the impression that no one had ever done this kind of thing before. He later found out, and this is like an addition to his introduction, there was somebody of the generation previous to his who had actually done some research in this line. This is somebody whose name is almost unknown now, Rabbi Yehuda Yaitelis, who lived from 1773 to 1838. This person wrote a parish on Onkelos called Kanfei Hayona. I'm not sure it was ever published. Shadal says the reason I felt free to go ahead and publish my own book, and instead of jumping the gun or being a masig vul for this Rabbi Yaitelis, First of all, that book was long and it was unpublished to that date. I have a feeling maybe never was actually published, because in the article I found about Rav Yaitelis, it doesn't even mention that book. Also, importantly, Rav Yaitelis did not have access to this very old Sefer Yair, which is what Shadal called this book that he found, and to various other editions. So Shadal was adding value that this previous author was unable to offer himself. Also, the organization of this other book was different. Rav Yaitelis organized his book by Parsha, as opposed to Ohev Ger, which was organized by topic. It was not, Shadal said, this is not a comprehensive book that I'm writing. It describes it in Hebrew as Lo hayata kavanati rak liftoach petach la'acherim. All my purpose was actually just to open up the way to other scholars who could follow and do more comprehensive work. So he felt there was room for this shorter work of his own, even though someone else seems to have preceded him in studying Onkelos. In a very cute way, he says, all of that said, he hopes that Rav Yaitelis will eventually publish this book of his, Kilo Mishpat HaGeula, because he's the one who has the first right of first refusal. That was very gallant of him, but again, it didn't stop him from publishing Ohev Ger, and I'm not sure that this other book was ever actually published. But in his own very honest way, this was part of his derech. He wanted to give credit where it was due at all times, and wanted to make sure that people understood that he himself was not the first person ever to deal with this sort of thing. Now, your question was, how was Ohev Ger received? I haven't seen a lot of information about that, but given that this was his first important book, published when he was about 30, and he went on to publish so many other things, I have the sense that this was taken very seriously and valued by the scholarly community of his day, because it was in many ways unprecedented. In some ways, I think it still does hold up. And again, this chief rabbi of Britain, Rav Adler, who wrote his own book, Nitina Leger, in some ways criticized what Shadal had to say, but apparently also valued it as well. So at least as far as the late 1800s, it was still being valued. Now that there's a brand new edition coming out in 2022 in Israel, I think that's probably an indication that somebody thinks there's still a market for it and there's still a value for it. I would tend to agree myself.
Yeah, especially like we said, the introduction part is still really interesting, and you know, the variants. I'm familiar. Obviously, there's today Parshegen, which unfortunately he was nifter. They put up a midbar, they put a dvarim, which is on Onkelos, but I don't know how much that deals with girsayos, variants in the text. I don't know offhand. I don't recall.
Yeah,
but
I would hope that some progress has been made since 1830. I mean, I think Shadal himself would have been shocked if no one else had followed up on his foundations. I think he wanted people to do that, but recognizing that hopefully there has been ground covered since then, I think it was a good first start. He made use of the materials that were accessible to him at the time, which most people hadn't thought of using, and I think it was a good foundation for the study of Onkelos.
Right, exactly. So that's what I'm saying. Even I was just mentioning one sefer. I'm sure there's been other work. I'm sure there's been more critical work done on Onkelos to some extent, but it's still overall that part is a classic. I'm still some of it is still holding up important. And then there's obviously the introduction, of it. Have you actually in your work, like I said, you translated so for Bereshis Shmois V'Yikra? Have you used Ohev Ger at all? Have you translated and incorporated this into your Chumash translation of his?
I did where he did. I guess you wouldn't say that I went out of my way to study Ohev Ger and pull in material that he himself did not mention in his parish. But very often what he will do in his parish is to say, years ago, I wrote an article in Ohev Ger, made a reference in Ohev Ger. I wrote an article in these other publications that he wrote for Bikurei Ha'itim, Karen Hamed. Very often he would say, yes, I said those things in my youth, but I don't agree with them anymore. And I did come across one example where he quotes himself in Ohev Ger. One of these very obscure expressions in Yaakov's bracha in Vayechi, where he's talking with Shimon and Levi. He does not approve of what they had done with killing off the people of Shem. And the phrase that one of the phrases he uses, Klei Hamas Mecherotehem, which Shadal translates himself as instruments of injustice are their swords, Mecherotehem. And he points out in his parish that in Ohev Ger, many years ago, I found a word in Syriac, which is, as we mentioned, a dialect of Aramaic. In Syriac, the word mechuria, which sounds like mecherotehem, means wedding. Now, what does this have to do with wedding? He understood this statement to Shimon and Levi to refer to their trickery of the city of Shechem, where they said, we will give you our daughters, let's intermarry, let's marry each other, which turned out to be nothing but a trick and an instrument of injustice. You could argue maybe that's what mecherotehem means, but later in life, Shadal says, that which I wrote in Ohev Ger, based on the Syriac, is not the way I view it now. Interestingly, what he did was he connected it with Greek. He wasn't the first to do that, but he aligned himself with those who said mechera or machaira is a Greek word meaning sword or knife, which is a whole other discussion. But he very often changed his opinions as the years went by, and this is just one example of where he cites his very early work, Ohev Ger, and begs to differ with himself. And I did drop a footnote to explain that more clearly in my translation of Bereshis.
Okay, so, listen, as we said, I'm not an expert in Onkelos, so I'm sure many listeners are more of that and know specifically, different Sefarim perhaps, and like we said, how it holds up today, but it still is important. One of the original works written on this, and the introduction and the first, his intro, his Akdama and Chelik Rishon, the first, these 32 Nesivos as he goes through it, are still important, classic, very, very interesting to read through, just in general to read through. Like I said, he has some discussion back and forth with the Rambam, and he quotes Akeda, he's quoting others, and he has other discussions and quoting, some of them are longer. He goes back and forth. So it's definitely interesting to read through. And, like other things he wrote, it's not a hard read to necessarily read his stuff. So it's worth reading. Have you ever thought about translating this, or not really?
Very frankly, I have not. It's really only in more recent times that I've looked in any depth into Ohev Ger. The examples that he gives, as we discussed, are really very fascinating. It might be worthwhile for someone, me or someone else, to prepare at least some sort of translation of at least part of these Netivot and describe what it was that he thought Onkelos was doing. Hasn't been my emphasis. My goal in life is to plow through the Perushim that he wrote on the Torah. I'm making progress on that. My goal after that is to tackle his translation and commentary on Yeshaya, which many people consider his masterwork. So that's been my focus. Although I have been branching out. I recently published an article translating letters between Shadal and his great Italian contemporary and rival Elia ben Amozeg, who they disagreed very fundamentally on the value of the Kabbalah, and they had letters back and forth, just absolutely fascinating, jousting with each other and expressing great love and esteem for each other, and yet attacking each other mercilessly. Very interesting letters. I'm hoping that was just recently published in Chakira, a little plug for myself. What I'd like to do also is to include those letters as an appendix to my latest volume of translation of the Chumash, which is Bamidbar. That's almost done. Yeah, you were about to ask me, I think, what's the subject? What's the progress with that? I'm almost done translating Sefer Bamidbar. I've had great enjoyment doing that. Both, just to recap what it is that I do, Shadal has two different things going on. He translated the text of the Torah into Italian for a general Italian Jewish audience. Separately, more in keeping his own students in mind, he wrote a Perush on the Torah and several other books of Tanakh in Hebrew. It was two different projects, and only after his death were they put together in single volumes of each Chumash, the translation and the Perush. And long story, but because I started learning Italian in my youth and became fluent enough in that language to understand what Shadal was doing with his text translation, besides his Hebrew Perush, I decided when I was fairly young to do, because I had this unusual skill set, to translate both of these things, Italian to English and Hebrew to English. And that's what I've been doing literally for the last 40 odd years. And lately I've been speeding up a bit, thank goodness, because I'm getting older. And we're almost ready to put out Bamidbar. I think by the next Bamidbar reading cycle next year is our goal of putting out that volume. Then, of course, I will go on to Devarim and then look what there is, probably Yeshaya.
Do you find that Shadal in his own Italian translation, was he trying to do the same thing like what Onkelos was? So he was trying to gear it towards the regular people, so therefore he was kind of doing these klalim like he says in here?
I think to some extent he did a little bit of that. I don't think that was his main focus. I think he felt that people could handle it. One example comes right to mind where he did something like that, where Yisachar is born and Leah is naming him. This is after the incident of the Dudaim, which she persuaded Rachel to give to her. What were the Dudaim? Nobody really knows for sure. Were they a love charm? Were they a token of esteem? But for some reason, Leah was very anxious to get them. And she told Yaakov, I have I have hired you because I gave these Dudaim that my son found to Rachel. So in exchange for that, I own you temporarily. And he went along with that. And so Yisachar, the way she names him is, in a sense, it's because I hired my husband. Now, in Shadal's translation, he doesn't say that. He says, I borrowed you. He has Leah saying, I borrowed you, which is a much nicer way, I think, in some ways, of saying, you don't want to say that this was a financial transaction. This was I borrowed you from your other wife. You might say that this was something like what Onkelos did in some of his translations, but I don't think that was Shadal's main focus. He was writing so that the Italian Jewish public should understand what was going on. And the way we know that is because sometimes right in the translation, he'll put in bracketed phrases explaining what he meant. Sometimes those bracketed phrases will turn up in his Hebrew Perush. Other times they won't. And one of the things that I'm hoping to accomplish for the modern English reader is they will recognize what's going on here, what Shadal was doing in his translation and in his Perush. Sometimes they don't even agree with each other. He didn't get the chance before he died to make a comprehensive edition and get some of these contradictions ironed out. Sometimes it's kind of astonishing that he contradicts himself. Sometimes, well, okay, they didn't quite agree. But that's part of the fun that I have in translating his work.
So your first 3 volumes are available from Kodesh Press. I'll put a link. And so you hope, I guess, next year Bamidbar, that the Bamidbar should be out. Is that the hope?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is like I said, we decided this is I reached out, I figured we should have this conversation because this new edition came out of Ohev Ger. Like I said to listeners, I think it's interesting. I don't know, I didn't ask you what you think of, is it worth, would you suggest listeners to read this, just to read the introduction, even just to get a sense of Onkelos. Obviously, you can read other Mefarshim and see what their take on it. You don't have to agree with Shadal, but just to see how he lays it out and goes through it and bring all those examples. Like you said, how your talk was, it just gets you thinking about it. Just that alone, it's very interesting.
I think so.
Yeah. So, okay. So I'll try to link to that. Like I said, I don't know what there's this new, the one who published Shadal Torah and on Nach and his other one, the other work that you mentioned, Chemlo.
Just to say a word about who this is. This Israeli publisher is named Yonatan Bassi. Bassi is a good old Italian Jewish surname. He is the descendant of one of Shadal's own students. And the way he got involved in this whole project is he was looking in his father's library years ago and found an old handwritten manuscript. He didn't know what it was. On examination, it turned out to be a transcript of Shadal's own lectures at this Collegio Rabbinico, which became his Hebrew parish in print. Apparently, he wrote out himself what he was going to say, and his students, either before or during the lectures, would very carefully write down what Shadal had to say. And because there is no one original manuscript that we have that covers all of his work, it's very important that there are these student transcripts that were discovered after years and years, which became the basis of Yonatan Bassi's new edition of Shadal's Parish on the Torah. There are other manuscripts as well. There's one in Colombia that I've had access to. I happen to know the librarian of the Jewish collection at Columbia. She very kindly made this manuscript available to me online. One of these days, I'd like to go in and actually see it for myself, but I haven't had to. It is online, and you have these resources that earlier Shadal scholars did not have access to, and so it's an exciting new part of Shadal scholarship.
Yes, shout out to Michelle, the librarian in Columbia, who is an avid listener of the podcast and was a guest on the podcast previously, all the way in the beginning.
Regards to you.
Yeah, I'm sure she's gonna listen to this, and she's always, people can check out her at H Chesner on her Twitter account and check out what she's, posting different manuscripts and things from the library. Yeah, so a lot of Shadal's things are at Columbia, along with a lot of other interesting Kisvayad and other things. So, okay. So with that, I guess I'll link to a couple of these. Thank you for joining me to talk about Shadal and this work of his.
You're very welcome. It's been quite a pleasure.